the Russian fleet had to abandon Sevastopol and retreat to the east. And that first opened up, obviously, Ukraine to be able to use the western side of the Black Sea. And then the second thing I'd say is allowing a drone into your now major naval base is a massive breach of failure of security again. And I think it shows complacency and competence by the Russian Navy and the Russian fleet. And thirdly, I think I'd say it shows the sort of growth in the technologies of drones in the air, on the water, underwater.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we are talking to the former UK Defence Attache to Moscow and Kyiv, John Foreman. A Royal Navy veteran, he has had military diplomatic appointments in the US, with NATO and the EU, and served on global maritime operations. John, welcome back to Frontline. Good to see you.
Hello, Kate.
Hi. Well, this week, let's start in Britain. The head of Britain's armed forces warned there was a 16% chance of a NATO country being in direct conflict with Russia in 2026. What do you think of those kind of statements? And what do you think direct conflict would look like if you think it is possible?
Yeah, but obviously I read the Chief Defence Staff speech and the one by the head of MI6. And I thought, firstly, the speech by the head of MI6 was very good, actually. I thought it was a clear argument linking her own experience to where the threat is and how technology will help intelligence in the future. And I think she was quite right to spell out the nature of the Russian threat to our security in terms of cyber and assassinations and political interference, and why we need to remain focused on it. I thought the speech by the Chief Defence Staff was a bit of a curate's egg, to be honest. I mean, I agree with his personal priorities about investing in our people, about improving readiness, and transforming the UK military. But I don't agree with his assessment about the Russian threat. I mean, the official assessment is that the Russian direct attack on NATO and the EU and UK is 5%. It's remote, less than 5%. And that's the same as the American assessment. And I think he was quoting the 16% figure as a sort of crowdsourcing site, which people, get points for making predictions, which are correct. And that was by 2027. So I think that remains remote. And in fact, when I was in Lithuania, I asked the question, will Russia attack the Baltics? And they said, quote, they have no such assessment. And of course, their own capacity is increasing by 2030. So I think we have to be very careful. The war, large-scale war, it won't be just a nibble in Narva or a little cross-border incursion. If the Russians would do this thing, would be a regional war, including involving nuclear and conventional forces. And we shouldn't get ourselves in a position of wishing ourselves towards that position. I think, war remains remote. We're investing heavily in our defences and deterrence. We already overmatch Russia, and we will continue to do so. So I think the threat is more likely in the MI6 area than in the MOD area.
Yeah, and to that point, that was the first speech by the new head of Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, and she warned of Russia's bullying and sabotage tactics as it seeks to subjugate Ukraine and harass NATO. Do you think President Putin is seeing a real opportunity now to fulfill his ambition, if you believe that is what it is, to break up Western alliances?
Well, I mean, I pointed out on social media this week that Russia's been conducting such operations against Europe since the 1920s. And the way the Russia goes about it in trying to undermine our institutions, to undermine our democracy, to break us apart, to split the Europe from North America, it's been pretty constant since the Second World War. The tools they use are changing, but actually the intent and the ways they go about it is pretty similar. And this is because, as Orwell explained, nuclear weapons have provided us a degree of stability in Europe. So in this non-peace, we're not a war, but we're not at peace either. That's where Russia operates. I think things like artificial intelligence and cyber have given Russia new opportunities recently to continue that sort of campaign against us. But I think, as the previous Chief of Defence Staff noted, actually it's quite relatively quite small scale in comparison to what we had during the Cold War. And actually, our removal of Russian intelligence service operatives inside Europe over the last 10 years or so has dramatically reduced Russia's ability to operate inside Europe. So I agree that the threat is there, but I don't think we should overstate it. And I think with investment in our security services and cooperation with others, we can handle it.
But do you not think that with the publication of the US national security strategy, which Putin may be rather pleased with, seeing it's sharing a similar vision in some places with his own, that this is perhaps an opportunity with the Trump administration to double down on his ambitions?
Yes, I mean, I think everybody's concerned about US involvement in Europe, engagement in Europe. But I saw yesterday the Senate has passed a new spending resolution committing to a US commander of military commander in Europe, in terms of US forces remaining in Europe, US nuclear guarantee, and also investment in the Baltic defences into Ukraine as well. So I think you have to be slightly careful reading from a document like the National Security Strategy, which frankly is made up by sausage making between various government departments, actually how that's going to be implemented. I mean, I think actually US policy towards Europe and Russia hasn't dramatically changed. US want Europe to do more for its own defences. They want strategic stability with Russia because of the nuclear threat, and they want a, quote, just and lasting peace with Ukraine and Russia. So let's not get subject to Euro doomsterism, which I think unfortunately affects some of the debates at present. I think US forces are likely to pull out of NATO and Europe, and I think also the US nuclear guarantee survives.
So you're just back from Lithuania and Norway, two NATO members. What's their perspective on the threat posed by Russia at the moment? Are they taking a fairly level-headed view, do you think? And where do they stand on the scale?
Well, I was actually struck how calm and pragmatic everybody was. I expected there to be more shrieking and hand-waving about the Russian threat. But I think I looked to them, they had no illusions about Russia. They're quite clear. Obviously, they've got a long history and they share borders. Secondly, they are convinced that the US role is critical to their security. They don't see the European Union, for example, being able to fill that gap. They have no illusions that the European Union will be able to speed up procurement to become self-sufficient over the next decade, which means we can have to carry on buying American stuff. But I think the commonality was that they're going to have to spend more on defence. I think Lithuania is now at 5.5% GDP. And speaking to my Norwegian colleague, who I was staying with, Norway had 10 brigades in the army in 1991. It's got 1 brigade now, so it needs to increase up. It's going up to 3. Investing in ships, investing in submarines. So I think there was commonality, but no real hysteria. I think actually perhaps the level of hysteria, or should we say of overstatement, increases the further you get away from Russia. Those who are much closer, much more focused on pragmatics and practical matters rather than esoteric discussions about whether Russia's going to attack. And as I said, I asked the question, neither think that Russia poses immediate direct military threat against them.
Interesting, though, that Lithuania's former foreign minister has been very outspoken supporting Ukraine, has compared the prospect of ceding the Donbass to Russia, to Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, to Hitler in 1939. Is he right?
Well, in Lithuania, I listened to the president of Lithuania speak, I listened to the current foreign minister, and also the Lithuanian, who is the Commissioner for Defence of the European Union. They were all pretty calm and pragmatic and results orientated. I mean, I shared a platform with Mr. Landsbergis back in last December. I know he's a passionate advocate for more European action for our defences. But in some ways, I think his argument is already happening. I mean, there's been a generational shift in defence spending in Europe over the last 10 years, certainly since the invasion. And in the next 4 years, we'll be spending $1 trillion on defence in the next 4 years, having spent $560 billion in the last 4 years since the invasion. And we're now spending in Europe, European Union, UK, Norway, more than the United States. So I think there has been action. I mean, obviously, the money has to be spent wisely, and there are massive obstacles to spending that because of protectionism and overcapacity and bureaucracy. We need to speed everything up, but I don't think everything is bad. On the question about the Donbass, we all know that Putin wants the whole Donbass. That's his main effort. He wants to move the Ukrainian fortress cities, which might, in due course, enable him to carry on attacking. So that's why Ukraine doesn't want to give them up. That's why I think the peace talks are stymied, because that's going to be a critical issue, along with money and along with the nuclear power plant of Zaporizhia and also NATO membership.
It does look like we're heading for yet another failure of any negotiations, and it's been said to me by another analyst that the failure is likely to happen towards the end of this year, and then what we look for next is how Donald Trump will react, which we about mid-January. Is that how you think it might pan out?
Well, I wouldn't say it's over yet. I mean, I think if we looked on the cup half full, cup half empty discussion, the Americans are still engaged. Americans put an awful lot of effort into getting the two sides to even consider the possibility of talking to each other. We just had a round of, quote, constructive talks in Berlin with the Americans, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians, and now the Americans will go back to talk to the Russians. I mean, I think we're quite away from a lasting peace deal, but I think if they're saying that 80 and 90% of the issues are actually sorted, we're getting down to the really difficult issues. I don't think it's over yet. So I wait to see whether the whole process collapses. And I don't think that, as people said back in the 28-point plan emerges, it's all surrender and appeasement, and we're going to give Putin what he wants. Having said that, ultimately the proof will be the pudding. We heard Putin speak yesterday about his goals. I mean, he says, I want peace and negotiation discussion, but if not, we'll carry on fighting. So I think we have to see what comes out of the next round with the Russians and whether we can move on from there. But I think the issues of size of the Ukrainian army, Ukrainian borders and territory, recognition of the occupied territories, Zaporizhia, those are the big issues. That's where it's going to come down to.
And it was reported that one of the real breakthroughs in the latest negotiations is the US offer of this platinum standard security guarantee. How genuine do you think that offer is? Because it is time limited, isn't it? Is it about... do you see it as a genuine offer, or is it trying to put pressure on President Zelensky to accept what is on offer now?
Well, we all know that, as our Prime Minister says, the peace has to be just and lasting. So just is like acceptable to Ukraine, can't be forced down the throat, and lasting means security guarantees. Without security guarantees, the peace will break down. I think America's gone further than it's gone previously since 1991 in offering positive security guarantees towards Ukraine as part of these discussions. Other nations can feel that with the Americans there, the backstop, that they could roll in as well. What can France and UK, Turkey, Germany offer? This is because Ukraine will not get into NATO. So this has to be bilateral, multilateral security guarantees rather than NATO guarantees. I saw a draft of a text a couple of weeks back, and they were pretty robust. It's more along the lines of sort of NATO-style guarantee. But I think, as President Zelensky said, this has to be written into law in the United States. It can't just be done on the basis of a presidential whim that gets up in one morning and says, well, these things don't apply anymore. It has to be written into the Senate, and I think that's correct. And I think the Senate, who are pretty pro-Ukrainian, to be honest, who control these sort of things, I think there's space for that to be done. But ultimately, I think all nations will have to think, if the peace broke down, would they be prepared, or we be prepared to use military force against Russia to restore the peace? And I think we've got quite a way to go in that discussion, yeah.
And while all of these talks go on, Russia is very keen to make the US administration believe that its victory is inevitable in Ukraine, that it's just a matter of time. Why does Donald Trump believe this? And how does that deception filter all the way from the battlefield to the White House?
Well, I think the American assessment is probably based on the fact that they believe that Russia still has a strategic initiative, that it's still getting enough people to fill its ranks on the front line. Its economy is under severe pressure, but it hasn't collapsed. And Europe hasn't been prepared to really bring home the price of war to the Russian economy. So I've said before, I think both sides of this war, this attritional war, are losing, but ultimately Ukraine is the weaker party. It's probably losing more quickly than Russia is. So it's a bit of a race to the bottom. Ukraine's got severe problems with manpower. We know about the problems with money. We've got the problems with Russia just being larger and having more military potential. So I think that's where he's coming from. I mean, sometimes he says it inaccurately or loosely, but I think that's where they are. Ultimately, he sees Ukraine is not an existential threat to the United States or existential issue. And secondly, he sees that Russia has the advantage, and he's leaning on Ukraine to do the deal. It's hard. It's realpolitik. It's not particularly pleasant, but that's where we are.
Would really like to get your understanding of what exactly happened with this Russian submarine in Russia's Novorossiysk naval base that Ukraine claims to have sunk with unmanned water vehicles. What do you think the reality is here?
Well, of course, the Russians denied the submarine's been damaged, but they denied everything. They denied Ukraine sank the Moscow 3 years ago. So they lie about everything. But I think, for me, there's two or three deductions. I mean, firstly, the Russian fleet is now based in Novorossiysk, not based in Sevastopol. In Crimea, the Russian fleet had to abandon Sevastopol and retreat to the east, and that first opened up, obviously, Ukraine to be able to use the western side of the Black Sea. And then the second thing I'd say is allowing a drone into your now major naval base is a massive breach of failure of security again. And I think it shows complacency and competence by the Russian Navy and the Russian fleet. And thirdly, I think I'd say it shows the sort of growth in the technologies of drones in the air, on the water, underwater. I mean, the Ukrainian Navy, with assistance, has come a very long way in being able to target the Russian ships, submarines in the Black Sea, and now she's getting something with a heavy charge into the main anchorage shows where that's got to, and I think we can probably learn quite a lot of lessons from that.
And how much do you think Ukraine's maritime capabilities have developed over this year, particularly using Sea Baby drones and AI in the Black Sea? But more recently, they're also starting to target oil platforms in the Caspian Sea.
Well, so war was the mother of invention, and Ukrainians have showed themselves to be pretty inventive. People say that they managed to target the Russian Black Sea fleet without having their own navy. I mean, I think they've adopted a sea denial strategy. They can't control the Black Sea themselves, but they can deny use of the Black Sea to the Russians. And I think I saw Ukrainian generals say that the cycle of technological advance inside the Ukrainian armed forces generally and at sea is like every 6 months, sort of generational change, which shows how quickly things are evolving. I think we've seen, autonomy, how the drones have gone from being controlled by a person on a controller via satellite link through to being autonomous. That was on the surface. Now, if the Ukrainians have cracked how to do autonomous underwater vehicles going to harbours, then that's another step forward in their development. But I see this constant cat and mouse. The Russians have sort of respond with this, and therefore the Ukrainians do that. And for the Ukrainians, keeping the Russians pinned into their naval base and attacking them where they think they're safe, obviously strikes fear into the hearts of the Russian sailors and prevents them operating more widely.
If we can talk to events today, we're talking on Thursday at 1:00 in London time, and vital talks as we are speaking are going ahead in Brussels on financing Ukraine's war effort. It's still no unanimous agreement as we're speaking right now on releasing up to 210 billion euros in frozen Russian assets. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the outcome perhaps later today as we stand? Do you think, because there's been so many incarnations of trying to get this deal done, is this the last chance?
I mean, firstly, I think, Russia, we all know that Ukraine needs money. Without money, Ukraine's going to not be able to pay its people, pay its soldiers, keep supporting troops at the front line, and keep the lights on and services going. So this really matters. So the worst case scenario is that Ukraine starts to run out of money next year, is in a fiscal crisis. I mean, I think there's two ways that Europe's been looking at this. One is to use the Russian assets. I think they talk about 90 billion out of the pot of 210 billion to create the precedent and then be able to use more in due course. Or the second is to use unspent EU funds as part of the budget. I mean, this is a continent with a GDP of $15 trillion or euros. So we're talking about small sums in the great scheme of things, but it's become so totemic. So I think probably if the EU can find ways to assure Belgium in particular that it's met its concerns about legal, financial, economic risk, I think there's a path to be found. It may be a blob of the two options. It might be some use of the Russian assets, and it may be some use of the EU unspent funds, and it might be more sanctions being placed on a permanent basis rather than temporary, so they can't get voted down. Other legal assurances. But I worked in the European Union. Every council tends to come to these sort of massive moments, and they all seem to find a way. And I know that Germany wants to find a way, the Commission want to find a way, and I think they probably will, but it will be a very late night, I imagine, with lots of arm twisting and manoeuvring and shenanigans and threats being issued to smaller nations to come into line, including Hungary.
What about the Russian economy? How much pressure do you think it's under at the moment? And are the US secondary sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil activated and working, the secondary ones? It's claimed that imports by India and China have only gone up in recent weeks.
Well, I mean, again, I'm not a massive economic expert, but I think the Russian economy has endured much better than most analysts expected it to. I mean, obviously, it's got inflationary pressures. They're borrowing heavily. All the money, they're now spending 7% of their GDP on defence. That's money which is not going elsewhere. There's the impact on living standards. But the question for me is, are these sanctions actually affecting the Russian war machine? I think the answer is no, because Russia seems to keep finding a way to divert other money from elsewhere into defence. And secondly, as Russia has moved away from Europe, it's found new markets, in particular in Central Asia with China. So it shows how amorphous, how difficult economic warfare is. I do think that there's more scope for the Americans to take sanctions or take action against the Russian economy. And we'll have to see if the talks break down. Back to your other question, then does Trump bring even more hard sanctions down, in particular the banking sector? But I think looking ahead into 2026, we know that Russia's got economic problems, but they're not quite as acute as Ukraine's financial problems.
And just finally, John, we're fast approaching at the end of the year. If you were to reflect on the effect the Trump administration has had on the war in Ukraine in 2025 and look forward to the effect it may have in 2026, what would you say? What would your assessment be?
Well, I think in 2025, the United States moved officially from a position of supporting Ukraine with arms indefinitely and economic money to trying to bring the thing to an end. I mean, we knew this from Trump before he became elected. He said it at the inauguration. He spent a great amount of political capital trying to bring about a deal. And as I said before, America's still heavily invested in this because it doesn't want to be bogged down, as it sees itself, in a minor European issue. From the American perspective, he wants to concentrate on China and resetting strategic balance with Russia. So if I reflect, I think the key consequence has been for America to shift emphasis for this onto Europe, whether it's with NATO or whether it's Europeans standing up and doing more to support Ukraine. That's why we're having these discussions in Brussels today, because America stopped financial support to Ukraine. That's why NATO and the European countries are having to buy US weapons to send them, because America stopped sending weapons directly to Ukraine. So I think what we've seen is a breakout of real hard-nosed, realist machine politic from the White House on Europe and Ukraine, and to a degree Russia. My concern is that Russia has not had the same amount of pain exerted on it as Ukraine has. And I worry about the capricious nature of the White House, who seems to blame, occasionally Trump blames Ukraine for being invaded in the first place, when the blame solely remains on Putin.
And what about looking ahead to 2026?
Beyond 2026, I would say I would expect the Americans to remain engaged. I mean, I expect that the pressure on Ukraine will only intensify. And I think Trump wants something signed by the anniversary of his inauguration in January. I don't think he wants to see it drag on. So although I hope America remains engaged in the process and trying to bring the two sides towards substantive face-to-face discussions, which has been the objective since Alaska, my concern is that he will just wash his hands of it, toss it over to the Europeans to sort out. So I think back to the question about Norway or Lithuania or indeed Europe, keeping the Americans involved, both in NATO and in the process about Ukraine, is absolutely vital for us. We can't do this ourselves. for obvious reasons, and we want Americans' involvement in the talks and the process to remain strong.
John, it's been good speaking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.